On this course, we want to understand humans' ethical abilities, the kinds of process which underpin them, the consequences of facts about the processes for political change, and the consequences of facts about the processes for ethics. What we're looking at in this lecture are two phenomena which tell us very important things about humans' ethical abilities. The first of those is moral dumbfounding. Moral dumbfounding. Steve, what is moral dumbfounding? Good question, Steve. Well done. Here it is. Here's the question. Well, Haidt and colleagues say, who actually I think coined the term, that moral dumbfounding is the stubborn and puzzled maintenance of a judgment without supporting reasons. Stubborn and puzzled maintenance of a judgment without supporting reasons. That expression comes from some unpublished research that dates back to a report from 2000. So Haidt and his colleagues created a series of tasks, and I'll start by telling you about the tasks and then I'll tell you what they did with them. So some of them were morally provocative but harmless. That's what they said. So for example, the incest scenario involved two siblings having consensual sex using extremely good birth control methods, right? So there was just absolutely no danger of any reproduction occurring. Or cannibal involves a researcher in a lab who is working in a mortuary for research purposes, and they finish with the body. They're about to destroy it. All the science is done, and what this researcher does, she carves off a bit of the body, cooks it up, and has a tasty supper from the body. Right. So that's the cannibal scenario. So these are supposed to be morally provocative because they tap into people's concerns with things, I suppose, like purity and sanctity and the rest. But they're also supposed to be harmless. No bad consequences are supposed to be possible. And then they compared these scenarios with what they call non-morally provocative but harmless. So in the roach case, for example, what they did was they took a glass of water and asked the subject to drink from it, fine. And then they took a cockroach, showed the subjects that the cockroach was fully sterilised, absolutely super sterile cockroach, and dipped it into the glass of water, took it out again, and then offered them the glass of water to drink. Would you drink that? Or in the soul case, what they did, this is my absolute favourite actually, they asked participants for a monetary reward. I think it was $2, but this was 2000, so that was when it was worth something, of course. What they did was they asked participants to sign a piece of paper signing away their soul after their death to the researcher Scott Murphy, who was in the room with them, and then to tear that up. So the thought here is that nothing bad can happen to you for signing that piece of paper and tearing it up, but it's non-morally provocative, or at least many people would find that, I guess. So here's what they did. So they first of all presented the scenario, and then they said, is that wrong? Is there anything wrong with that? And then the researcher always counter-argued. No matter what answer was given, they sort of counter-argued, a bit like in the Monty Python argument clinic sketch, I guess. The researcher there, Scott Murphy, was always offering a counter-argument. And then at the end, they gave subjects a questionnaire which asked them various things about what they'd done. So how confused they were, how irritated they were, and so on in the questionnaire. So that was their first experiment. But there's one important thing that I've just about forgotten. I was about to forget that. And actually, a lot of researchers have forgotten this, and I think this is terribly important. You see, it's not just that these researchers compared the morally provocative with the non-morally provocative. They also had a control condition. So they had a control condition, so they compared morally provocative and harmful with morally provocative but harmless. And that comparison is often forgotten, and you're going to see later, I think it's terribly important. So in their control condition, there was the following dilemma: should Haidt steal a drug to save his dying wife? And here you can think that could be pretty complicated, right? So if his dying wife has less entitlement to the medicine, and Haidt's act of theft will deprive another person who's perhaps more eligible, more entitled to the medicine, then, that might be one thing. If on the other hand, Haidt's stealing the medicine is not going to deprive anybody else of an opportunity to be treated, then it all looks different, doesn't it? So what they're predicting here is that there will be a different level of dumbfounding between harmless and harmful, or harm-involving scenarios. And I'm highlighting this because that comparison has often been forgotten. It's important for two reasons. The first is that when we're thinking about dumbfounding, we probably shouldn't think of this as an absolute thing. Either you're dumbfounded or you're not. We should probably rather think that there's a degree of dumbfounding involved, right? So that the less harm involved, perhaps the greater dumbfounding you would get. But it wouldn't be that one of these is not at all dumbfounding and the other is maximally dumbfounding. Probably they're all on the spectrum, lying somewhere between. So I think that's very important to bear in mind the control condition, and you'll see that a few things go wrong when we forget that later. It's going to come up twice actually. And the researchers stress this in their paper as well. So they stress that they actually plan to do comparisons with the control condition. Now, one thing we have to bear in mind here is that this is unpublished data. Steve, why are you talking about unpublished data at all? Do you know what, Steve? I would never normally talk about unpublished data. I would never do that. Well, why not? Why wouldn't you do that? Well, usually when data hasn't been published, that's because it hasn't been reviewed. And usually that's because the researchers have some doubts or questions about the data. So I take the peer review process to be the minimum standard that I need to talk about it. And actually, Steve, normally, if I was going to talk about some data, I wouldn't want it just to be published. I'd want to see that there were similar results obtained from a variety of different labs, perhaps from different scenarios. So here we're really going, far out on a limb. Why are you doing it? That's what I was asking you. You're not explaining it. You're making it more mysterious. You're right, Steve. I am making it more mysterious. The solution is simple, though. This is actually a very highly cited study. It's a highly cited study that's been enormously influential. And as we'll see later, there's very little else that has been published. So this study is generally taken to provide evidence, even though in my view, we shouldn't do that. In my view, this is rather dubious. But we have to discuss it because there's no better source. You'll also see there's a mitigation later. Sorry, so that's a sort of long discussion with myself, actually, perhaps with you as well at some point, about unpublished data. Don't use it. Never use unpublished data. It's very, very bad. So what did the results actually say? Well, first of all, Haidt and colleagues observed that it often happened that participants made unsupported declarations. For example, it's just wrong to do that, or that's terrible. They made the fewest such declarations in Heidt's. That's the case where Haidt was going to steal some medicine to save his dying wife, and they made the most declarations in the incest story. Also, and this was very interesting, participants often stated that they were dumbfounded. That's to say, they didn't necessarily use the word dumbfounded, but they made a statement to the effect that they thought there was an action was wrong, but they couldn't find the words to express themselves. Now, the participants made the fewest such statements in Heidt's, more in incest, cannibalism and soul. So you can see that actually worked out quite well. The incest story and the cannibalism story seem to capture what they wanted. And it's interesting that the non-morally provocative story about soul, it's not clear to me entirely that is non-moral, but there you go, also was sort of up there. So you don't necessarily need what seems like an obviously moral situation to get the dumbfounding effect. Very good. Now here I'm emphasising again that the comparison is with the Heidt's case. So it's not that people are fully dumbfounded in one situation and not dumbfounded in another. Moral dumbfounding is a matter of degree, a matter of degree. And that's what these studies are telling us. You can get more or less dumbfounding. They also mention, but don't report, study 2, where apparently they increased the cognitive load, perhaps by asking their subjects to count backwards or something like that. And they said that increased the level of moral dumbfounding without actually changing what subjects said. So that would be helpful for us. If we think moral dumbfounding is a consequence of the inaccessibility of relevant reasons, we would expect cognitive load to make relevant reasons more inaccessible, harder for them to think about, and therefore dumbfounding to increase. So that sounds like a plausible result. But here we don't even have an unpublished report, so there's not much we can do with that. All right. So in this situation, you're naturally looking for a replication, extension, or a review. Be careful with a review. So the study is highly cited and mentioned by many people, but it seems to me that most people who mention this study uncritically accept it. So that's not very helpful for us. There is, however, an attempt which presents itself as a replication. So Roisman and colleagues re-implemented some of the scenarios involving incest and cannibalism, and they found very little dumbfounding in their participants. So they record a negative conclusion. They think that a definitionally a definitionally pristine bout of moral dumbfounding, MD, is likely to be an extraordinarily rare find, one featuring a person who doggedly and decisively confirms that very same act that she has no prior normative reasons to dislike. Now you can see here that this does not seem to be entirely in the spirit of the original study, which was really about, people being more dumbfounded in one situation and less dumbfounded in another. Right? But they didn't say, for example, that in Heidt's people were not at all dumbfounded. Some people did seem to be somewhat dumbfounded, just as you'd expect. So it seems like there's a bit of a fake target here when they say definitionally pristine bout of moral dumbfounding. We shouldn't be committed to there being any such thing in the first place. So I'm not super impressed by this. They go on to say that 3 out of 14 individuals disapproved of the siblings having sex, and only one of those 3 maintained this disapproval in the stubborn and puzzled manner. So they regard this as a failed replication. But to me, there's 2 things wrong. So one is that they do seem to have found at least one case of dumbfounding. And philosophically, what matters for us probably is just that it can occur. Secondly, the failure of these researchers to find that could well be that their implementation was not particularly good. So they don't provide any reassurance that they were doing things particularly well otherwise and that they did get other results. But perhaps most importantly, what you notice is that there is no comparison with a morally provocative but harmful scenario, like Haidt, who has to steal for his wife's medicine. So they're really using a different approach here entirely, and so then it's not surprising that they do get somewhat different results. So I'm rather disappointed. What looks like a published attempt to replicate appears to me initially to pull us away from Heidt's, but on reflection, closer scrutiny doesn't really give us much reason to doubt, but also doesn't give us any additional confidence that moral dumbfounding exists. All right, so in the absence of a replication, an extension or a really good review, what are we going to do? What are we going to do? We're going to take a DIY approach. Now, this is a very unusual thing to do. DIY experimental psychology is generally not recommended. But I'm going to show you why I think this is a good idea. So what I want you to do is to do what I've done, but do read the notes below this first, because there are some warnings there about this, some trouble that you can get yourself into if you go up to random strangers and ask them about, having sex with a sibling or eating parts of a dead body that they're responsible for. Sometimes you get people feeling a little bit insulted and it can cause aggression. So there are some warnings about that. Do take those warnings very seriously. But here's what I did. You can see what I did. Here's Isabel, and you're going to see how she responds to a question which involves a morally provocative but apparently harmless situation. Let's take a look.
Now I want you to imagine that very unfortunately little Maya gets run over outside our house. Would it be okay to eat her?
No.
Why not?
Because she's a dog and, well, if you love something, then if it accidentally gets killed, like say if you own a pig and you want to eat it, then I guess that's okay somehow. But then if you have like a pet who you love and then it accidentally dies, then it would be sad if you eat it.
And what if the neighbours ate it? Would that be okay for the neighbours to eat little Maya?
Well, not really, because that would make other people feel really sad.
But if the neighbours were eating it, would you try some?
No.
Would it be wrong to try some?
Well, kind of, because it's wrong for the neighbours to be eating the dog. So if you try some, then it's wrong for you to try some.
So what I want to show you there is that although I'm not doing a comparison with the control case, and although I've adapted the dilemma to make it more friendly for younger people, we can still get what appears to be elements of dumbfounding. And in particular, what you see is that people are, Isabel here, is adopting a position and then attempting to give reasons for it, and sometimes discovering, as in the case of it's wrong to eat something that you love, sometimes discovering that the reasons that you give are not actually good reasons at all, and having to go back, right? So it looks like the judgment is coming well before any ability to articulate reasons, and that would be characteristic of moral dumbfounding. I should say that Isabel herself is somebody who reasoned herself into a position of vegetarianism, so she's not kind of unfamiliar with the arguments in this area, and you still see some elements, I think, of dumbfounding in this video. So what I think we need to do is to collect a series of samples and see to what extent we can reproduce the dumbfounding effect informally. My own take on this is very simple. We don't have strong evidence. We don't have strong evidence for dumbfounding. We don't have the kind of scientific evidence that we would normally like. But if you look carefully in everyday life, it's reasonably plausible that such a phenomenon exists. It's one of those things that is actually relatively easy to spot, and so maybe it's okay to think that it exists independently of having what we would normally want, which is, you know, the full-on piece of scientific evidence telling us this really can occur, this is how it is. All right, so I'm hopeful then that we've got two things so far. We know what moral dumbfounding is, and we understand that although the evidence for it is quite weak, it might be okay for us exceptionally to think it probably occurs, right?